So the big news this week is that the Houthis have said that they will stop firing on ships going into the Red Sea, which could potentially mean a influx of ships, a drop in transit time, price changes. We are back with Container Bytes, episode 10, double digits. Judah, break out. What does the Houthi ceasefire or cessation of violence mean for global freight?
Yeah, so there were two developments. One is that the Houthis released a statement saying that they have ceased attacking Israel-linked ships in the Red Sea, and that they will do so as long as the ceasefire holds in Israel. The other development report that representatives of the major container lines met with representatives of the Suez Canal, basically to discuss planning for a return. So those are the two big developments. I think immediately it probably doesn't mean that container carriers are going to start going through the Red Sea right away. I think they, as we've been saying all along, they really want to have kind of demonstrated quiet and demonstrated security for some period of time before they're going to, return to using the Red Sea and the Suez Canal.
In the past, there was a ceasefire that lasted for like a month or so before it was broken, right? So I
Right.
think that they're probably waiting for the geopolitical situation
Right.
to
Very true.
cool
Very
down.
true. And that didn't kind of spur any of the major carriers to go back. There are some carriers that have been sending some vessels through, and they have kind of increased the number of sailings, but it's still pretty minimal. But the other question is, if one carrier decides to go back kind of completely, that would represent an advantage to that carrier compared to the competition. So that might be a spur for other carriers to follow. But I think it will probably be more, all carriers kind of deciding at once.
The Supreme Court had an initial ruling on the legality of the tariffs. What was the decision, and then what is the impact of that for shipping?
So there's no decision yet. So the development last week was the hearings, and the Supreme Court heard arguments on the appeal of the lower court's decision that President Trump's use of EPA for tariffs, and they're used for the fentanyl tariffs and used for all the reciprocal tariffs, that was overreach. So the Supreme Court has heard arguments last week about whether to consider upholding that decision that would strike down EPA tariffs. And the big development is that from listening to the proceedings, that it really seemed that most of the justices, agreed that this would be overreach, and that would mean that those tariffs would be struck down. What does that mean for for trade and for freight is a really good question. The White House will, definitely be motivated to, if those tariffs are struck down, to kind of reinstate them by other means, and there are other means to do so. The question is whether it would kind of create a window of a low tariff reality, and which would cause shippers to front load as many goods as possible, like we've seen previously this year. I think probably there'll be steps taken to make sure that doesn't happen. So there's kind of a law where the president can enact 15% tariffs for 150 days. I think it's never been used or rarely been used, but it's on the book. So that's something that the president could do for country-specific tariffs, at least for the short term, while they use other methods, which are also kind of more recognized, that could apply country-specific tariffs as well. So it's another area of uncertainty.
I feel like so much of this comes down to, hey, what happened this week, and does that mean that people are going to ship more or less? And just for super simplicity, we saw there was those FAA strikes or shutdown last week that has just been resolved right now, but had minor impact just because it was mostly domestic. But with peak season starting to come to an end, more capacity, Red Sea, tariffs not necessarily going to be moving the needle a ton. Where are prices right now from an air and ocean perspective, and what are you expecting them to do over the next couple of months?
Yeah, so it's a different story for ocean or for air. For ocean, we're really well past peak season, especially this year when it was a little bit earlier. But nonetheless, we've seen rates starting to increase. So we saw rates to the West Coast increase almost 50% or $1,000 per container last week on start of November GRI. And that's really significant. And there's a lot of speculation that those rate levels wouldn't hold. But we've seen, we're already into a couple weeks into November, and those rates are holding. But this is a low demand time for the container market, but nonetheless, we're seeing rates go up, and that means that carriers are kind of reducing capacity. They're managing capacity. They're blanking sailings. So if they're able to keep rates elevated, even though we're in a low demand period, we'll see rates a little bit higher than maybe we otherwise would have expected. But as you said, we are kind of in an overcapacity environment, so it's going to be a kind of hold off and manage that even when demand is low. But Probably we'll start to see more seasonality next year. So overall, I think lower rates than we had last year just because of the capacity growth. If carriers could return to the Red Sea, then that'd mean even more capacity, even more of a challenge to carriers
Mhm.
to elevate rates. But that's kind of what we're seeing in ocean and air. We're really starting the peak season period right now. Air peak season is, in November, December, and we're starting to see rate increases from China to US went up to about $6.30 last week. Last year was about $7 per kilo. Um, so we're seeing rates increase from, they were about 550 or somewhere around that a few weeks ago. And that shows that there is some peak season demand. A lot of people were skeptical that there was going to be much of a peak season. We're seeing those increases there. We're seeing some increases, not as to as high levels for Asia, Europe, where rates are up around $4 per kilo, which is a little bit lower than last year. The interesting piece here is, we've had a decrease in volumes to the US because of changes to de minimis. So there's a drop in demand from China to US in terms of volumes because of a drop in e-commerce, and the big increase to Europe. But nonetheless, we've seen rates kind of more or less on par to last year. That's because just as quickly carriers are shifting capacity around. So if that's the case, that
Mhm.
might be kind of an indication of what we're going to see this coming year as well. Overall growth, right? E-commerce is still a really big factor in the air cargo market, even if it's being less to some markets where there are barriers put up and more to other markets.
So a lot of flexibility. Judah, thanks a lot for this. And then just as a reminder for our listeners, if you like this, nothing helps us more than jumping into Apple Podcasts or Spotify and leaving a review or sharing this. Thank you so much for joining us. See you next week.